Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Parsons Technical Webinar Series. I will be your host today, Jessica Bennett. Today we have John Daly with us presenting on navigating the surge, real-time strategies for the imminent electrification demand. So we'll go over a few housekeeping items first. So we'll be keeping all phone lines muted throughout the presentation to limit any background noise. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please enter them in the chat feature, or you can hold them until the end if you want to ask them live. This webinar has been approved for one professional development hour or PDH credit. If you'd like to receive that credit, there will be a form that you'll need to fill out to get attendance, and that will be available via a link that we'll post in the chat a couple times throughout the webinar. Just a warning, there are several multiple choice questions you'll have to answer to get that credit. We'll also post those in the chat if you have any issues accessing the form and the questions throughout the webinar. And finally, this webinar is being recorded and will be available up on our YouTube channel in the next few days. So just a really brief agenda. So I'll introduce our guest speaker. He'll present a core value moment and then get into the technical presentation, and we'll wrap up with Q&A at the end. So a little bit about John Daly, our presenter today. He is the Senior Growth Operations Manager at Parsons for the IPK Power and Cyber Division. This is focused on cyber and operational security for electric, water, gas, and other utilities. John recently joined us with the acquisition of IPK's Power Partners. Some notable projects that he has been involved in include the first distributed energy resource management program in Nova Scotia, which will be discussed in this webinar, and so you can learn a bit more about that. A cybersecurity monitoring program for electric vehicle charging stations that was a first in the industry, and advanced cybersecurity programs at over 100 different utilities across North America. And with that, I'll hand it off to John for the core value moment.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you everybody for coming today. Before we get started, for all of our technical webinars, if you haven't been to one of these yet, we like talking about the 6 core values of Parsons before we get started. And those 6 core values are safety, quality, integrity, diversity, innovation, and sustainability. And the core value I'd like to be talking about today is innovation. So talking about innovation, what to do about grid electrification. That's part of the main topic everybody came here to hear me talk about. And while our country is pushing for more sustainable energy options, which is fantastic, but with the electrification of the grid, this creates stability issues as well as cybersecurity exposures. Today's session, I'll be talking about the stability issues, but wanted to touch on an innovative approach Parsons is taking to solve the cyber threats. As more and more of the grid upgrades from its aging infrastructure components from the past, there has been an increased number of hacks on critical infrastructure. This has led to increased regulation requirements, and with that, some serious cybersecurity mandates that are happening across the board. Parsons has been focused on cybersecurity for over 75 years, but we wanted to help critical infrastructure more. Utility IT departments themselves are overworked and understaffed. That's just the reality that many of them are facing. And yet they still need to be aware 24/7 of the utility network and how it's performing. That's why we at Parsons have developed a critical line of defense for SIP professionals to prevent cyber attacks on their section of the grid. And this is called Cyberscape. Cyberscape is our real-time continuous threat and cyber monitoring solution currently being used at over 100 utilities around the country. By analyzing traffic and patterns of the utility, we're able to spot threats before they become a major issue. We're also able to, for lack of a better way to put it, we're able to tell you when the back door is open and what you got to do to make sure that lock is secure as possible. So we're constantly monitoring traffic happening within your utility space and really any network for that. IT, OT, ICS, cloud, and public safety communication networks are all covered by this. And this innovation platform is here to assist the critical infrastructure environment itself. And we're really proud of it. Like I said, today I'll be talking more about the stability issues that come with electrification of the grid, but I'd love to talk to anybody, and my contact information will be at the end of this about our cybersecurity offerings as well. But with that, let's dive into the presentation you're all here for, Navigating the Surge, Real-Time Strategies for the Imminent Electrification Demand. AKA the stressful reality of the U.S. national power grid and ways to sleep better at night. So I'll be talking about things that our organization has been in conversations with for in the critical infrastructure space, and talk about ways people can just be ready for what's happening. First off, before we get into any doom and gloom, let's talk about how the adoption of green technology is awesome. It's great across the board, and our country's doing a great job with that. Adoption of products not needing fossil fuels has risen in the US quite a lot. Let's talk just about cars for a second. In 2023, 16.3% of new car sales were either hybrid or battery electric vehicles, and it was 12% the year before that. That's awesome. Technology has gotten cheaper for the creation and implementation of green solutions as well, to really augment existing infrastructure. So solar panel costs have dropped 90% since 2010, which is crazy. And wind turbine prices themselves have decreased by 60% since over the past 13, 14 years. Also, huge win, making it much more of a viable option and not just a dream of the future. So there's also a clear cost benefits on the commercial side of things to switch to electric mobility options with lower fuel and maintenance costs when you go to an electric vehicle. That can be for organizations in shipping and handling are switching to electric vehicles. We've got more, you might have your child on an electric school bus going on right now. So we're not talking about just commuters going to and from their jobs with an electric vehicle across the board. This is happening, and that's great. And of course, there's more investments in renewable technology sprouting up around the country, focused on combating the climate crisis. Awesome. This technology is helping. And the US government recognized it. They put $1.2 trillion for transportation and infrastructure in the new Jobs Act that the Biden administration put out, with $550 billion of those dollars focused on new programs themselves. This is great. But the demand right now is lapping capacity, and we're going to be in big trouble if utilities don't do something now to prepare for the next few years. So that's what we're going to talk about today. The power demand increases are really a big problem. Demand for power is only getting bigger, and utilities really got to be ready for this. Data centers, technology advancements in manufacturing, like automation, stuff like that, and electric vehicles are going to be the main power gobblers that are happening in this near future and even right now. A third of total U.S. energy consumption is from the industrial sector alone. And it's anticipated that's going to grow even more. There's more automation going on than ever. There's more reliance on speeding up the processes for industry themselves, leveraging technology. And with that, we need more power to run the shops, to run those businesses. Reuters is estimating the U.S. capacity will need to double by 2050. Double. That's crazy. If 60% of all cars are electric vehicles alone by 2050, it's got to double. And that trend, and that's what we're seeing right now. If we're talking just on demand, that's what we got to figure out. But we also have to combat with climate change happening right now in the climate crisis. There is an increased number of extreme weather events that are demanding power beyond the everyday strains that are happening in that first bullet that I talk about. Climate change has led to more frequent and severe weather events like heat waves, freezes, storms, and wildfires. And these events not only increase the demand for electricity because people are turning on their air conditioning more, they're turning on their heat more, but it can also damage the infrastructure itself. So let's look at just a couple in the last couple of years. Climate change is leading to more peak demand periods during the climate crisis happening right now. Everybody's familiar with the unfortunate situation that happened in Texas in 2021 with Winter Storm Uri. It led to the crippling of the Texas grid itself, and millions of people were without power, heat, or clean water as temperatures started to plummet. They were not prepared for the cold weather that happened that way, and with that, just the grid just failed, and we had, unfortunately, many deaths that came from that. In 2021, on the opposite end of the thermometer in the Pacific Northwest, they had a major heat wave that shattered the temperature records. Things were normally in like 60-degree range, and at that time period, it jumped above 100 degrees. And it led to rolling blackouts as they tried to keep the grid functional and going at the same time so people could keep their air conditioning on, but we unfortunately had to deal with the strains that came from that. Mobility electrification is a strain as well, and it's going to be one of the driving forces at play here as it's coming up, as more people start adopting electric vehicles in the industry itself. I'm talking about with neighborhood transformer overloading concerns on its own. You take a look at your block, transformers are sized for the assumption that typical demand loads is what we're going to have in your community if you're looking out. Typical houses are going to have air conditioning, hot water tanks, lighting, washer dryer, all that stuff. Now imagine if per home they add a level 2 electric vehicle charger on a home. That's kind of the equivalent of adding a 3 to 4 ton air conditioner unit that's going to run 5 to 10 hours continuously at 6 to 10 kilowatts. And if more people are buying electric vehicles, you're adding a ton more strain to those transformers because that's a lot more load. If everybody got a new air conditioner, things just wouldn't work on your street. It's kind of what we got to prepare for as more EVs are coming into play. All right, so let's assume people aren't charging at home. Let's look at what the government's planning on doing for rollout for adding additional charging stations. So the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Bill plans to install 500,000 direct current fast charging stalls around the country with a minimum of 4 ports capable of simultaneously charging 4 electric vehicles at once. So that's going to be between 150 kilowatts to 350 kilowatts per electric vehicle stall. That's great. You'll be able to drive your electric vehicle and charge where you need to. But what this is doing is it's adding the equivalent of the power to operate a Walmart per stall in the country. That's a lot more demand that's going to be needed. And of course, like I mentioned before, the industry fleet upgrading to electric vehicles with the same strain concerns that's coming in. Short haul shipping, public transportation, school buses, and delivery fleets are leading the adoption of battery electric vehicles, which is great, but it's also adding that strain. So you're probably hearing all this and you're like, but we have a strong grid, right? Not really. So we're going to talk about that. The power demand stress points going on right now in distribution really comes down to how things are being distributed. I mean, distribution is very, very old and very inefficient, and that's not cool. Much of the US power grid is decades old and wasn't designed to handle the current load demands. That's a lot of the money in that Infrastructure Jobs Act, that 1.2 trillion that I talked about before, is trying to upgrade these aging pieces and these components. 70% of transmission lines right now are over 25 years old. So they just can't handle this. And they're just old anyway at the end of life that we got to fix. Investment in distributed energy resources takes time to build out is another thing. So while we're talking about like, all right, we need more power as fast as possible. Okay, so if you want to build a solar project, that range is a utility scale solar project is going to range between 18 months to 4 years from inception to operation to set that up. You've got to do the site selection, you've got to do all the environmental and permitting, you got to do construction, and then you got to connect it to the grid. You could be looking at around 4 years. So even if you've got that surge in, oh, we need more energy right now for our clients in the next year, you might not get it. Same sort of thing you got to think about for wind energy projects. They've become cheaper to make, but it's also going to range between 2 to 5 years because not only do you have to think about everything that was covered above with the solar projects, you also got to add in the manufacturing of the turbines there too. It's just going to take time to manufacture and construct these wind farms. They're great. We need to be doing more of them, but they take time. And while let's say you set up one of these solar projects or wind farm, you then need to probably upgrade your existing transmission infrastructure as well to handle that new load coming in. So you're adding even more time. Realistic consequences. All right, yeah, this is scary stuff. Are we even going to be able to handle this? What happens if we don't? Well, what's going to happen is we're going to have an increased number of power outages in the country. A grid that's not equipped to handle that high demand that we got is going to experience more frequent and prolonged power outages. That's just the reality of it. And it's going to be particularly problematic during those extreme weather events, like I mentioned before. If we're overloading the local distribution systems, you could have with that high concentration of electric vehicles perhaps coming in, you're going to have a localized grid failure is going to happen with a spike of usage. Or a utility would need to figure out how to do an intentional power back, rolling blackout sort of thing to specific sections to prevent a wider grid blackout. You're just constantly sort of balancing what to do as you're running around trying to figure out how to manage the power appropriately. And of course, with that, supply and demand, that's just common of it. The electricity prices are going to go up across the board. And if you're a utility, you're going to have angry customers because the less supply means that the energy bills are going to be higher. And that's not fun for anybody. So as I covered all these kind of like doom and gloom moments about, all right, what is the role of a utility operator today? Well, they have to keep everyone's lights on by finding more capacity while they're also supporting a cleaner, more efficient, and more sustainable energy future, while they're remaining fiscally responsible to everybody involved. And they have to do it as fast as possible before electric demand becomes greater than the existing capacity. No pressure, right? Like that's totally doable. Well, we're going to talk about what a utility can do about this, specifically about some short-term and long-term strategies to keep the lights on right now. When I'm talking about short-term versus long-term, we're talking about short-term being something you can do within the next 2 years, and then long-term being a utility can do within 3 to 10 years, or to really start planning around. Both short-term and long-term can be happening at the same time. It's not like you need one before the other. It's best to be working on everything together, but realistically, you got to figure out, all right, what's the low-hanging fruit I can tackle first and set in motion so I can get control over the power of my grid as fast as possible. And today I'm going to talk about some of these ways utilities can do so. Let's talk first about some of these targeted grid upgrades that I mentioned. The first thing you're going to want to do is initiate a grid resilience enhancement program. You got to figure out what's working and what's not in your environment. So a utility needs to prioritize the upgrades based on criticality, grid load trends they've got, and also the age and condition of existing infrastructures like transformers or wires. What do you got to replace as soon as possible? What could be good if you don't have the money to do that? The goal isn't to put a bandage on things. It's to make sure you're ensuring reliability for the future. The other thing you should be focusing on is going to be workforce development. Make sure you have a solid workforce development plan to ensure you have the skilled personnel across the board for these upgrades and ongoing support. You're going to want to invest people to learn about all the new technologies you're bringing in, and then also be ready to handle any changes to general operations. And I'll talk about that more at the end. And also, you're going to want to invest time for key employees to learn the specialized grid modernization technologies. And of course, I mentioned at the top of this, focus on enhancing your grid cybersecurity. I'm going to be talking about everything beyond cyber for the rest of this presentation, but it's still a short-term goal that you're going to want to focus on. How does your utility operate on the IT/OT front, and is it vulnerable to disruption? Are you vulnerable to hacks? Have you already gotten hacked and ransomware and you got to do something about it? You should figure out where to invest your time and money on cyber as well. But again, today we're talking about just the energy demand focus of this. Would love to talk cyber another time. The next thing that on our short-term list of initiatives that I think we at Parsons believe people need to focus on is strategic AMI deployment and system setup. If you're not familiar with it, AMI stands for Advanced Metering Infrastructure, and it's critical for the next few decades, really, at every utility around the world. Upgrading all these systems is critical. What you're doing is you're installing these types of meters around the service area, and it gives the utility near real-time data, such as kilowatt hour usage, the peak demands of the community, logs, time of use, and so much more. But AMI is more than just having a smart meter that feeds you data. It's a comprehensive system that does a lot. Not only can you gather all the detailed energy usage together in a proper data acquisition way, it also allows for everything to be securely transmitted as well. So you don't have to worry about any of the concerns on the cyber front on communicating this data about what might be down, how much building is particularly using, what are the peak demands for the whole community, all of that. And then all of this data you're going to pull into a management system to analyze this to effectively forecast the demand and planning response programs you need to put in place for your community. You're going to want to start with key growth areas first. If your budget is tight, where can you upgrade? What are the key areas you want full insight into of your community? You're going to deploy AMIs there if you can't roll it out everywhere in your community, and then expand each year for significant coverage from there. Once you've got better AMI meters in your community, there's more data and more ways to wield that data as well for you, in particular forecasting. How much demand are you going to have today versus tomorrow versus the future? That's what you want all of this data for. Implementing expanded forecasting involves several key steps. Data acquisition, we just covered that a little bit. You're going to leverage data from various sources, but not just the AMI meters. You're going to also include stuff from weather stations and market trends going on as well. Having that comprehensive data collection forms the foundation of your forecasting model and how much power you're going to need. On the technology investment side, incorporating advanced software to analyze this collected data. So it's not just, sitting, all right, I got the data and I don't know what to do with it. You got to invest in the technology to analyze this, to figure out what those patterns are and make those highly accurate predictions of your demands of your community. And then, of course, integration with grid operations. You're going to ensure that the forecasting tools are well integrated with our grid management system so the insights generated can be used effectively for real-time decision making. Are you close to a peak, and what's that's going to do to operations? Like, are you at a point of critical failure, or are you coming close to it? Having the forecast available and also having the real-time data available go hand in hand, and you're going to want to have that all in place. Plugging in your energy data with weather models and market trends will feel like you're having a crystal ball, which is why I got that picture on the side. All right, let's talk about some fantasy situation. Full disclosure, I am a New York Jets fan, so that's why I'm talking about this here. But let's do some expanded forecasting conversation. This isn't just about predicting weather conditions. It's anticipating how weather, along with other factors like customer behavior and market trends, are going to impact the electricity usage for a utility. So imagine this scenario. The New York Jets make it to the Super Bowl. Kind of ridiculous, but I'm hoping, hope on hope. But either way, in this scenario, the Jets are in the Super Bowl. It's also a weekend with a record blizzard in New Jersey, meaning more people are staying home. How is this going to impact the grid in New Jersey? Well, that's going to be something a utility's got to figure out. All these things coming together in this blizzard. You've got a major sporting event on TV. You've got the blizzard for the fan base and the majority of the people who are going to be watching it. Not that people wouldn't be watching the Super Bowl anyway, but now you've also got high energy usage for cooking happening at the same time. This could be a peak demand in New Jersey. You've got an increased residential energy consumption. So it's a big game. So more people are watching at home and more people are cooking at home than they probably would be if it wasn't a blizzard. Less big number of parties and more people doing it at home because you got people turning on their heating systems to work overtime during the cold of the blizzard, and an increased use of kitchen appliances for game day cooking that are going to be high power gobblers on their own. Number two there, it's the altered consumption patterns. Typically, energy usage might dip on a Sunday night, but with the Super Bowl, this pattern changes everything. We're expecting a spike during the game, followed by a rapid decrease afterwards because everything I talked about in point one. By anticipating this scenario through expanded forecasting, utilities can adjust supply strategies in advance. This might involve ramping up power generation ahead of the game or purchasing additional energy from the market to meet the expected demand. All those things you can figure out. And one way to solve this problem relatively quickly is if a utility has a demand response program set up. So like my headline says, you need a demand response program if you don't have one already for a utility. Systems where demand response program is a system where utilities actively work with their customers to manage and reduce the electricity usage during peak demand periods. So when you've got those spikes in power needs, you're working with everybody to make sure that everything that needs to be on stays on. And this is not about reducing overall energy usage for like the whole year. That's not what we're talking about. It's about shifting certain amounts of power and certain amounts of the load to off-peak times to make sure that everything still operates the way it needs to, but we figure things out from there. So how does something like this work? Well, during periods of high electricity demand, if you've got a DR program set up, a utility is going to trigger an event. This event is going to go as a notification to participating customers and request them to temporarily reduce their energy consumption. This can mean adjusting thermostats, turning off non-essential lights, or delaying large power-consuming activities. Big thing, think like a factory, a lot of machines, and it's like, hey, can you delay some of your start time a couple hours tomorrow, or delay some of the big power gobblers you've got on site because we're anticipating a peak. When organizations or customers themselves curtail, they get an incentive payout from the utility. This could be, normally it's a nice big check that they get, but it could be something like a rebate or something like that. DR programs are fantastic for alleviating the grid strain, and this is something that many utilities around the country have started adopting. By reducing the peak demand, we have enhanced reliability, and we're preventing the overloads from happening. reducing the need for additional capacity with cost savings. So it's more cost effective to manage the demand this way than it is to build a new infrastructure component itself that's generating more power. Because you need something kind of quick, you might not have 4 years to set up a new solar farm that plugs in, or have a nuclear reactor set up, or have a wind farm set up. This allows you to get control of your load faster. There's also environmental benefits to doing this. Lowering the peak demand can reduce reliance on fossil fuel-based peaker plants as well, thus reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which is a win overall. Talking about DR, let's focus on a case study here at Parsons we like talking about, specifically with Nova Scotia Power, and the first DR program in Nova Scotia history, which our group was able to put together. Nova Scotia Power had noticed that they had a big rising power demand in their community in 2021, and their need for a fix real quick. They wanted control of their load in case of emergencies, in particular during the winter months. So when people are staying home more because there's lots of snow in Nova Scotia, it's extremely cold in Nova Scotia, especially December through March. So they wanted to control that load in case of emergency, such as a surge or peak moments. In 2023, the program kicked off as Parsons worked with the top 200 power users in Nova Scotia to get control over their load. The program itself, it had a 2-year scope of work. They wanted to control 3 megawatts of the peak demand load that was happening in their community. And what we did is we deployed a DERMS software platform. So DERMS, I'll talk about more in a minute, but that's Distributed Energy Resource Management system. And this software helped for the control of endpoint devices to make sure people were getting notifications about, hey, we got a peak coming up and we got to curtail power. And then also we provided the energy consulting around this. So provide participant engagement, assessment, and agreement of services, figure out the baselines that they wanted for everybody in a pilot. If we control the load, what is this going to do to hotels, hospitals, commercial, industrial, residential customers all across the board? So we at Parsons, we set out to figure that out and make that happen so they could control their load. The playbook here and the key DR programs I want to cover. High level, we wanted to reduce the energy use for certain customers during high demand events, and they got paid a revenue per kilowatt reduced per season. When I talk about events, I'm talking about specifically designated hours that people find out ahead of time that says, hey, we're anticipating a peak. We're going to ask you to reduce your energy demand. We would tell anybody in the program you could have up to 12 events per winter season, and this could last about 4 hours. And with that, we would have them participate manually or through automation, where Parsons has a way to automate the electricity reduction if they wanted to, and many of our clients had picked that up. Hardware provided can send signals to the whole building automation system to reduce additional workload for participation. We sent the notifications out 4 p.m. the day before. We knew that there was going to be a we anticipated there to be a power load event in Nova Scotia, and that event could be canceled up to 2 hours before the scheduled time, providing ample notice. So if energy usage changes, a storm might go another way, where things change on what we're anticipating for power needs, we might have the ability to cancel the event. Not might, but that we would. And then, of course, everybody got paid. You would earn revenue per kilowatt of reduction at the end of each season. The simple pitch, we went out to the top 200 performers and said, hey, we're going to give you, if you say you're going to drop 100 kilowatts for events, you're going to get a check for $10,000 at the end of the season. Everybody liked that pitch. In year one, the goal was to have 3 megawatts of power under control. So we set aside $400,000 of total value in incentives based on saying $100 incentive for every kilowatt reduced. We also had folks who were the high energy folks said if you enroll 200 kilowatts, you'll get more than just that 10 grand. However, the average load drop over 12 events is only 160 kilowatts. So you might say, yeah, I can curtail 200 power, but we might not need you to curtail 200 kilowatts during the event. Most people did only 160. In this case, you'd get $100 times the average. So in this case, they got a check of $16,000 per event if they were willing to do so. We reached out to, like I said, the top 200 performers in Nova Scotia, and we had 57 folks sign up for this and said, yeah, count me in. This sounds great. I can make some money while also helping my community this way. Sounds great. We did this by running webinars, sending out mailers. We had our sales team hit the streets to have the conversations about exactly how to set up their base load management and all of that stuff. And we made it happen. And with that, we had a lot of happy people. As you can see from this picture, this is some of our clients holding big, giant novelty checks, talking about, how they saved power for their community in Nova Scotia, and they got money because of this. The incentive was there, and they're like, yeah, this makes sense for me to help in the peak load event, and then also I can reinvest some of this money into my business. It worked, and we proved that in Nova Scotia, we proved to Nova Scotia that they could that this was going to happen. We've done pilots before in other communities and stuff like that. So saying, oh, we proved it would work. We knew it was going to work at Parsons. Year one was such a success, and Nova Scotia Power increased their control this year. In year two of the program, they'd said, we just did 3 megawatts. Can we make this more? If we figure out how we want to do this and get the load up to 10 megawatts, is that possible? And you bet it was. We added 13 additional commercial and industrial utility partners to new utility participant agreements to this thing with the original 57 people. We grew the program, and now we have that minimum 8 megawatt of peak demand expected to be controlled happening, and it's happening right now. We've got another month of the program going on, and Nova Scotia has been very happy with adding the power. We've got, as at the bottom here, year two, 8 megawatts. Total incentive we were putting out there, $1.1 million based on a $100 incentive for every kilowatt. That's how much we put in the budget for this new thing, for this additional capacity. Demand response programs like this give utilities the power they need to respond fast when they have a peak event. So how do you set up a program like this if you don't have one already? Number one, you're going to want to do your customer segmentation and targeting. Identify which customer segments can contribute most effectively to the DR program. This is going to be who's your large players, who uses the most power in your community. Or maybe you want to look at the residential areas with a high energy use too. Incentive structures is going to be number two. You're going to design incentive programs to encourage customer participation. This may include reduced rates for energy usage during off-peak hours or rebates for reducing consumption during peak periods. Number three, you're going to reach out to all those customers. You want to educate them on what's happening and the benefits of such a program, how it works, how little this is really going to affect their whole business or their operations when you're looking at just shifting the energy usage that they have. If it's an industrial partner, this can be done through the workshops, mailers, or digital campaigns. And then we run the pilots. We set up a pilot program in the selected areas to test and refine the approach. Based on the success, you gradually scale up the program like we did in Nova Scotia. We went from 3 megawatts to 10 megawatts, where it's like, all right, this works. Can we get more? And talking with our customers, it's like, yeah, we could. Let's make this more. Let's make this better. Let's have some more control over the grid. And then, of course, you're going to want to monitor everything. Continuously monitor the program's performance and make adjustments as needed. You're going to gather customer feedback to improve the program and increase participation. Over time, you got more customers talking to each other saying, oh, I'm in this great program. You're going to want to get in this. It's easy for us to figure out the base load that you need for operations, and then we can help the grid itself. By implementing a robust DR program, we're not only improving our grid's efficiency, but also engaging customers in a meaningful way, promoting a more sustainable energy future. So I've talked about the short-term stuff. We got that figured out. We talked about targeted grid upgrades, AMI metering, forecasting, and demand response programs. Now let's talk long-term investments. I'm going to be talking about selective energy storage, renewable energy integration, expanded DER network, and enhanced forecasting. Selective energy storage projects. As we're talking about being 3 to 10 years out, you're going to want to start figuring out as a utility, what are ways I want to start investing money in the future. Energy storage solutions, we think are, they're growing in their efficiency and capacity. And I think this is definitely something that should be on your radar for a future investment project. If building a solar farm or wind farm is not a feasible thing for your community, battery farm is great. The strategy behind this, you're going to identify a strategic location for a whole bunch of batteries put together to focus on areas with high renewable integration in the future. And then also peak demand challenges. Who's going to be your power gobblers? How can you set up a way that you can leverage having a battery farm feed some of that peak and offset some of the peak demands that are going on? If you set up something like this with a storage system, it's going to help balance the intermittency of renewable energy sources that might happen between solar and wind, and also provide backup during peak demand and enhance the overall grid stability. Case study I want to talk about that I think is great. If you're not familiar with the Hornsdale Power Reserve in South Australia, get familiar. It's fantastic. In 2019, they opened as the world's largest lithium-ion battery installation at the time, aimed to significantly reduce the frequency and severity of blackouts in the region of South Australia. In that first year, they set this up, and the power reserve generated an estimated cost savings of 85 million US dollars in grid stabilization. That's awesome. They are currently providing 50 megawatts of power with a expansion of 64.5 megawatt hour for this battery farm down there that is just ready to tap into when they have a peak in South Australia. And they're working on growing this by 2026 up to 150 megawatt farm. That's awesome to have that much in reserve. They were able to set this up. And this is something that I think your utility needs to be paying attention to as like, yeah, energy storage is something that we should be looking into. The other thing that covers all of the others is having a distributed energy resource management system, aka a DERMS platform. Over the next 3 to 10 years, it's best to start planning around some grid expansion projects if you have not already. And the integration of renewable energy sources for generation is something that you should be looking at too. If you're doing all of that, you need a way to manage all those distributed energy resources that are happening appropriately. And a DERMS platform is going to be the way to do that. So integrating DERMS into grid modernization and DER expansions. Let's talk about that. If you've already set up a demand response program, good news. If you've already got the advanced AMI metering in your community as well, you might have already invested in a DERMS program at this stage to help manage the loads. Fantastic. If you have not, Parsons has a great one. Would love to talk to you another time about that. But for now, let's look at what are the main benefits here. You're going to optimize renewable energy usage. So what I'm talking about here is that having a DERMS platform at your fingertips, you're able to predict the generation patterns and predict the peaks that are happening, much like you would from your forecasting model, but it's all centrally located into a real-time solution. So it helps you adjust grid operations accordingly. What I'm talking about is when is it cheaper to use coal versus solar versus battery and storage versus wind and all of that stuff together versus hydro, whatever that might be. DERMS will allow you to figure out when is it not just most cost effective, but when is it most needed. It'll also help you with preemptively storing energy in batteries at low points in time and actively call DR events for you, much like we talked about before. It'll also help you do some intelligently, it'll also help you intelligently manage your DERs during disruptions to help maintain power supply, even when parts of the grid are compromised. One section of your grid isn't working because of the solar farm's down. All right, well, let's reroute some power because that's a tiny peak that we weren't anticipating. So let's figure out how we want to manage that and make sure power is going the right way. You can also improve your demand response participation this way, providing more accurate and timely data to both utilities and consumers. With a DERMS platform, you're able to do better forecasting when you're calling for events. Hey, I need you to only curtail 20% of your load versus 50%. People are going to be happier to be like, great, I can keep most of my operations flowing with minimal interruptions. With better insights into the grid's needs, consumers can then adjust their usage more effectively, leading to more people saying, yeah, count me in, I want to help out with this, and more significant energy savings. And also, like we talked about before about electric vehicles, facilitating this integration of electric vehicles into a community, you could also allow for some sort of smart charging capability. This is something a lot of folks around the country are starting to set up, where using a DERMS platform, you can ensure EV charging at homes or at charge points in public-facing areas like a Walmart, like a 7-Eleven, whatever it might be. They can ensure EV charging happens during off-peak hours or when renewable energy generation is high. So you're not having a lot of power going somewhere that people aren't even going to use it. There's 3 easy questions to get you started with these strategies that we covered here today. So number 1, which area of utilities coverage area has the highest number of weak points? You got to figure that out first as you're trying to plan for the future as a utility. Number two, how much capacity load would you love to have at your disposal for a demand response event? Is it 3 megawatts? Do you wish you could only control 1 megawatt? Are you like, man, I really would love to have 10 megawatt control right now? We'll figure out what that is, and then you can put a plan in place. And number three, what parts of your community are growing the most in the short term that are going to need more power than you're currently providing? You got to sit down, figure out these three. And once you've got those, you've got a good start to figure out how to navigate the surge that's coming from all the electrification happening in the United States. The road to as I have at the bottom there, the road to a stronger and reliable grid is not without challenges, like we talked about in this presentation, but we can ensure a strong grid by taking steps today by just asking these questions. And then from there, starting the action plan. So with that, thank you everybody for coming. I'm gonna open up the floor to questions and go from there. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you, John. That was a great presentation on the challenges that we're facing with the grid and electrification, and a lot of great strategies and how we can address those. If there are any questions, you can either raise your hand and you can ask your question live, or you can enter your question in the chat and we'll read it out. So I see a first couple questions in the chat. Is it feasible to implement a grid program management system similar to the one used in British Columbia, Canada?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Is it feasible to implement a grid program management system similar to the one used in British Columbia, Canada?
Oh, absolutely. You could set up a program like this at any utility around the country. Really, we've done this at Parsons. We've done this for electric. We've done this for gas. We've set up gas demand response programs in upstate New York and other areas around the country. So setting something like this up is very easy to do. You just got to figure out, all right, what's the incentive structure that you want to do and how much load you want to control. So any utility can work with an organization to set up, you make that baseline, you figure out, all right, how much power you want to control, and you identify where you're going to get that from. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay, the next question in the chat is, if the incentive for the Halifax program in year one was $100 per kilowatt, why were the total incentives $400K instead of $300K for 3 megawatts?
Sure, great question. So I'm glad you caught that. We made sure to have extra money in the program available if we needed to run any events longer than the original plan 3 megawatts. So technically, we were ready to support 4 megawatts in year one for Nova Scotia Power. We didn't need to, but we had that money in the budget available.
Okay, I see the next question from Ryan Thomas. You mentioned grid cybersecurity challenges. Do electric vehicles bring any additional vulnerabilities to the grid?
They do, and a lot of research is being done around the very idea from charge point security to how vehicles might be able to assist as a battery option with vehicle to grid technologies. So short answer is yes, mainly because we're adding more vulnerable points to the community, and we're adding more connecting points to grid infrastructure that may not be monitored appropriately. So yeah, you're creating more vulnerabilities that way. We've done some research projects at Parsons around cyber risk that could hit a charging station. We found everything from risk of overloading at the charging station to using the charge point as an access point to other IT technologies at the distribution centers. All in all, EV charging is fantastic, but it does add another point that needs to be addressed and watched. So you're able to track that using a DERMS program. You can track oh, hey, why is this charge point having a ton of usage right now when that one's never used at this time of day? That's like one of those red flags that might be like, is this somebody trying to cause an event happening? And all of that needs to be watched.
Let's see, we just got one more question. What sort of grid modernization technologies should utilities be training their employees on?
Okay, good question. So I did mention that where it's good for them to be training folks on their staff about all these modernization technologies that they're going to be implementing. So getting a handle on AMI sensors is a good one, and automation technologies in general to help with the real-time monitoring going on in the community. So that's one. Then getting familiar, I think, trend we're going to see a lot in the future is getting a utility staff familiar with how microgrids work and how they're going to affect the community is another thing that's worth investing time on. We're likely going to see a rise of industrial clients, perhaps setting up their own microgrids like solar farms or battery farms, et cetera. And how to respond to issues around those is going to be critical. So you got to have the staff be able to know how those are working and how they connect to the grid. And also designating someone, this is just John saying this way, but I think it's also good for a utility to designate someone to be the researcher on any grid modernization grant opportunities. It makes it easier at the utility side to be able to respond when opportunities come up to be, hey, here's some money to upgrade what you've got in your community. So that's just John saying that way, having another one where it's like, if you got somebody watching that stuff, you're just going to be better prepared.
Okay, next question is from Janet Brown. How realistic is it for your EV car to charge your house in a power outage?
So we're not quite there yet to have that. That's called like vehicle to grid or vehicle to charging station. We'll eventually, I'd love it if we get there to have your car charge your house itself in a power outage. Some new vehicles coming on the market do advertise that you could use it like it's a generator, but it depends on all about how much power you've got in the reserve to it. As batteries get more power to them for electric vehicles and have more storage capability, that becomes more of a reality where you might be able to plug your car into your house and then you've got that minimal reserve where you can run your fridge and a couple of lights during a blackout. That'd be awesome. That's going to happen soon. Some manufacturers have already started testing this, but it really comes down to battery storage side, how much power you can store in the battery of your car really right now. I hope that answers your question.
And actually, I'm going to jump in and ask a question. So when you're talking about the incentive program to be installing power stalls for vehicles, and you mentioned there's about one Walmart per charger for per stall for power use. So at 500,000. So over what kind of time frame? Because that's obviously adding 500,000 Walmart's worth of power demand is significant. So what's the kind of time frame for that to happen?
They're planning on doing that by 2040 is when they're planning to have. That's the goal of the NEVA grant right now, but they've already started implementing and breaking ground on a lot of these charging stations. They're looking right now primarily at like major highway stuff where it's like, all right, what are the major commuting roads or areas that people are going to be traveling the most on to set this up? But also the money is supposed to be in smaller underprivileged areas as well. But if you add the capacity of a Walmart in a town that, you know, in a smaller rural utility space, well, now you've just added maybe 300 kilowatt that needs to be on demand, ready at all times, and you're pulling from everywhere else on the grid. So yeah, as you're like, wait, is that realistic? Is like, how often is that happening? It's to have that 150 to 300 kilowatt like ready available at the charging station at any moment. It's not like the grid could turn that on and off. Well, they could turn that on and off with a DERMS platform, but for the most part, they're going to be operating like 24/7, which is pretty wild, which is why a lot of this is like, cool, we'll just have more charging stations and people can drive it. It's like, hold up, we got to worry about everything else on like power transmission lines. Can they even handle that? So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you. If there's any more questions, there's still time to if you either raise your hand and ask it live or put it in the chat. But we can go ahead in the meantime to the next slide. So our next webinar will be on March 13th, same time, 12:30 to 1:30 Eastern. It will be on managing complex environmental sites, advances in data management, client engagement, and community participation. We'll actually be presented by Carrie Crozier, Chris O'Neill, and Buffy Quinn. So we hope that you can join us for that. If there's any more questions that you think of after this webinar, feel free to reach out to John directly. And he'll be happy to answer any questions you may have, or if you want to talk about anything from today's webinar. So thank you to everybody who joined us for today's webinar, and we hope to see you again in March.
Thank you, everyone.